The view from the 53rd floor of the Carter Enterprises building in New York City was breathtaking. The glass windows stretched from floor to ceiling, giving a perfect view of the Empire State Building on one side and the Hudson River on the other. Alexander Carter, the billionaire CEO of Carter Enterprises, sat behind his mahogany desk, staring at the city lights as another long day came to an end. To the world, Alexander had everything: power, wealth, influence. But in reality he had no one. His parents had died in a car accident a decade ago, leaving him to run the billion-dollar business alone. Friends? He had none. Women? There had been many, but none stayed. Everyone wanted his money, his name, his empire. He checked his Rolex. It was already 9 p.m. His secretary Linda had left an hour ago. The office was empty just the way he liked it. He sighed, leaning back in his leather chair. He had built this empire from the ground up, but what was the point if there was no one to share it with? Just then, the silence was broken by the sound of his office door opening. Alexander frowned. No one entered his office unannounced, especially not this late. He turned his chair slowly and saw a woman standing at the doorway, holding the hand of a small boy. She had long auburn hair, piercing green eyes, and a determined look on her face. She was familiar, too familiar. His heart stopped. Emily Dawson. A name he hadn't heard in 5 years. A name he had buried under work, money, and power. "What the hell are you doing here?" Alexander asked, his voice colder than the New York winter outside. Emily didn't flinch. She took a step forward, pulling the little boy closer to her. The child, no older than 4 or 5, had messy brown hair and deep blue eyes, the same shade as Alexander's. His chest tightened. He wanted to deny the thought forming in his mind, but deep down, he knew the truth before Emily even spoke. "This is your son," she said, her voice calm yet firm. The words hit him like a wrecking ball. He felt his fingers tighten around the armrest of his chair. His son? Impossible. He stood up slowly, his eyes locked on Emily's. "I don't know what game you're playing, but I don't have a son." Emily's jaw clenched. "Yes, you do, Alexander. His name is Nathan, and he's your child." Alexander's gaze shifted to the boy. "Nathan." The child stared back at him with curiosity but no fear. There was something in the boy's expression that made Alexander feel uncomfortable, like looking in a mirror. His mind raced. 5 years ago he had been with Emily. They had been in love, or at least he had thought it was love. But then she had left without a word. Or had he been the one to walk away? Why now? Alexander's voice was cold. Why come here after all these years? Emily took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around Nathan's tiny hand. Because he deserves to know who his father is. And because, she hesitated, her green eyes filled with emotions she was holding back. Because I never wanted your money, Alexander. I never wanted anything from you. Alexander let out a bitter laugh. Then why are you here? What do you want? Emily took a step closer, her voice quiet but firm. Nothing. I just wanted you to know the truth. For the first time in years, Alexander Carter, one of the most powerful men in New York, felt completely powerless. The child, his son, was staring up at him, waiting for something. A reaction, an answer, anything. But Alexander had none. He had spent his life building an empire, making millions, expanding his business to London, Dubai, and Tokyo. He had outsmarted competitors, defeated enemies, and crushed obstacles. But in that moment, standing before the son he never knew existed, he felt like he had lost control for the first time in his life. The silence stretched between them. Emily sighed. I don't expect anything from you, Alexander. I just thought you should know. That's all. She turned to leave, but before she could take a step, Nathan spoke for the first time. Mommy, is he really my daddy? The innocence in the boy's voice shattered something inside Alexander. His throat felt tight, his hands clenched into fists. He didn't know how to answer. He didn't know what to say to a child he had never met, never raised, never even imagined existed. Emily looked at Nathan, then at Alexander. Her eyes softened just for a second. Yes, sweetheart. He is. Nathan nodded as if processing the information. Then, to Alexander's shock, he stepped forward and stretched out his small hand. Hi, Dad. Alexander stared at the tiny hand extended toward him. The same way he shook hands with millionaires, CEOs, and investors, but this time, it wasn't a business deal. It was something much bigger. Something he wasn't ready for. His fingers twitched. He could walk away. He could ignore them and go back to his billion-dollar empire. Or he could take a step into the unknown, the terrifying, unfamiliar world of fatherhood. For the first time in years, Alexander Carter hesitated. Before going to the next, please subscribe to our channel, like and share with friends. The silence in the Carter Enterprises office was almost unbearable. The city lights of New York glittered in the background, but inside, there was only the weight of an unexpected reality. Alexander Carter, the powerful billionaire who had conquered business empires, now stood frozen before a 4-year-old boy claiming to be his son. Nathan's small hand remained extended, waiting for his father to shake it. But Alexander's fingers twitched, unable to move. His sharp blue eyes flicked from the child to Emily Dawson, the woman he had loved and lost years ago. "Alexander," Emily finally spoke, her voice softer than before. "Say something." But what was he supposed to say? The emotions running through him were foreign. He had walked into boardrooms with ruthless billionaires, faced hostile takeovers, and even stood at his parents' funeral without shedding a tear. Yet now, standing in front of a child who carried his blood, he felt completely powerless. Nathan finally pulled his hand back, disappointment flickering in his deep blue eyes, the same as Alexander's. "Maybe he doesn't want to be my dad," the little boy mumbled, his voice barely a whisper. Emily sighed and bent down beside him. "Nathan, we talked about this, sweetheart. It's not about what someone wants right away. Sometimes grown-ups need time to understand things." Nathan nodded, but his small shoulders slumped. Alexander exhaled sharply, raking a hand through his dark hair. "Emily," he said at last, his voice low and strained, "I need answers. Now." She nodded. "Fine. But not here." Alexander glanced around his massive corner office, where he had spent countless nights working alone. The place that once felt like his fortress suddenly felt small, suffocating. "Let's go," he said. Emily hesitated. "Where?" "My penthouse," he said firmly. A flash of uncertainty crossed her face, but she nodded. "All right." The elevator ride to Alexander Carter's penthouse in the Upper East Side was quiet. Nathan held Emily's hand, looking around in wide-eyed fascination at the luxurious glass walls and gold-trimmed elevators. "Mommy, this place is like a castle." Emily smiled at her son, but her gaze flickered toward Alexander. His jaw was clenched, his eyes dark and unreadable. The elevator doors dinged open, revealing a stunning penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows, white marble floors and expensive modern furniture. Nathan gasped. "Wow. Mommy, look. You can see all of New York." Emily, however, wasn't admiring the view. Her eyes were locked on Alexander. "This is where you live?" she asked quietly. "Yes." "It's cold?" Alexander didn't reply. He walked to the bar, poured himself a drink and then turned back to her. "Now talk." Emily took a deep breath. "You want the truth? Here it is. I didn't leave you, Alexander. You left me." His grip on the glass tightened. "That's a damn lie." Emily's eyes flashed. "Is it?" "Think back, Alexander. You became obsessed with your company, your meetings in Dubai, your deals in London. You didn't have time for me anymore. You were always away, always choosing business over love." Alexander swallowed but remained silent. Emily continued, her voice thick with emotion. "I tried. I waited. But one day I found out I was pregnant. And when I told you," she paused, looking away, "you told me we'd talk later. But later never came. You left for a 3-month deal in Tokyo. So I left." Silence. Alexander stared at her, his mind reeling. Could that really be how it happened? In his memory, Emily had just disappeared. Vanished from his life. "You never called?" he said quietly. Emily's bitter laugh echoed through the penthouse. "And you never looked for me?" Alexander's throat felt dry. Had he really been so blinded by business that he let the only woman he ever loved slip away? He looked down at Nathan, the boy who had been watching the conversation with quiet curiosity. His son. His mind raced with regret, but his heart told him something else. This wasn't just about the past anymore. It was about the future. "I didn't know," Alexander admitted, his voice softer now. Emily sighed. "I know. That's why I'm here now." Alexander kneeled down, finally at eye level with Nathan. "Nathan," he said carefully, "I didn't know about you before tonight." The little boy blinked. "You didn't?" "No. But I do now." Nathan stared at him for a moment before asking, "So, what happens now?" Alexander didn't have an answer. But for the first time in his life he knew one thing. He couldn't let this child, his child, walk out of his life. He wouldn't make that mistake again. Before going to the next, please subscribe to our channel, like and share with friends. Alexander Carter had built an empire. He had closed billion-dollar deals, negotiated with the most powerful men in the world, and survived ruthless corporate battles. But nothing felt as terrifying as the moment he realized he was looking at his own son, Nathan Carter. The boy sat on the sleek white couch of Alexander's penthouse, his small hands fidgeting with the hem of his sweater. Emily sat beside him, tense and watchful, as if she expected Alexander to say something that would shatter the fragile moment. But Alexander had no words. He had been caught off guard before, when a deal collapsed, when a competitor outmaneuvered him, but never like this. This was different. This wasn't business. This was family. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he cleared his throat. "Nathan," he said carefully, "what do you like to do?" The boy hesitated, then looked up at his mother. She gave him a small nod of encouragement. "I like airplanes," Nathan said. Alexander raised an eyebrow. "Airplanes?" Nathan nodded quickly, his small face lighting up. "Yeah. I want to be a pilot one day. I like watching planes take off. Mommy takes me to JFK sometimes to see them." Alexander's lips twitched. JFK Airport. He had spent years flying in and out of that place, but never once had he stopped to admire the planes. He had always been in a rush, always moving, always chasing the next deal. And yet, here was his son, who simply loved to watch planes fly. Something in Alexander's chest tightened. "You know, I own a private jet," he said after a moment. Nathan's eyes widened. "You do?" Alexander nodded. "Would you like to see it sometime?" Nathan's mouth fell open. He turned to his mother as if seeking permission. Emily hesitated but finally smiled. "Maybe someday," she said. Nathan turned back to Alexander, his excitement barely contained. Alexander exhaled slowly. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to do, what he was supposed to say. He had spent his entire adult life alone, dedicated to his business, convinced that emotions were distractions. But now emotions were all he had. I want to know him," Alexander said, his voice raw. He turned to Emily, searching her face for understanding. "I don't know how to do this, Emily, but I want to try." Emily studied him carefully. "Are you saying that because you feel guilty? Or because you truly want to be in his life?" Alexander hesitated. He had never been the kind of man who acted out of guilt. Every move he made was calculated, precise, intentional. And yet this was messy, complicated, uncontrollable. But it was real. "I don't know how to be a father," he admitted. "But I want to learn." Emily let out a slow breath. "Then you need to start small, Alexander. You can't just throw money at this and expect it to work." Alexander flinched at her words. Was that what she thought of him? That money was his only solution? Maybe that's who he had been before. But not anymore. "Tell me how to start," he said. Emily looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned to Nathan. "Nathan, honey, do you want to spend time with Alexander?" Nathan bit his lip. "Like, just me and him?" Emily nodded. "Yes." Nathan looked uncertain. He turned to Alexander, his little fingers still playing with the fabric of his sweater. "What would we do?" he asked softly. Alexander thought for a moment. He had no idea how to entertain a child. He didn't know what kids liked, what they enjoyed. But then he remembered what Nathan had said earlier. "I can take you to see the planes at JFK, he suggested. "We can go inside one. I'll even show you the cockpit." Nathan's face lit up with excitement. "Really?" Alexander nodded. "Really?" Nathan turned to his mother, eyes wide with hope. Emily hesitated. She was still wary, still unsure. But when she looked at Nathan's face, she sighed and nodded. "All right," she said. "But no bodyguards. No business calls. Just you and Nathan." Alexander swallowed. "No work. No distractions. Just being a father." He nodded. "Deal." Nathan could barely contain his excitement. His small hands were pressed against the glass as he watched the planes take off. Alexander stood beside him, watching him instead of the planes. "Do you think they go fast?" Nathan asked, his voice full of wonder. Alexander smiled slightly. "They go very fast." Nathan turned to him. "Have you been in a plane before?" Alexander chuckled. "More times than I can count." Nathan's eyes widened. "That's so cool." Alexander hesitated, then said, "Would you like to go inside one now?" Nathan gasped. "Really?" Alexander nodded. "Come on." A few minutes later, they were walking across the private tarmac toward a sleek Gulfstream G650, Alexander's personal jet. Nathan's jaw dropped. "This is your plane?" Alexander smiled. "Yes." Nathan ran ahead, excitement radiating from every inch of him. He reached the steps but hesitated, turning back to Alexander. "Are you coming?" he asked. Alexander's chest tightened. This was it. The first real step toward something more. Toward being a father. He took a breath and climbed the steps. Inside, Nathan's excitement was contagious. He ran from one end of the cabin to the other, touching everything, pressing buttons that thankfully did nothing, and asking a million questions. Finally they reached the cockpit. Nathan's eyes sparkled as he looked at the rows of controls and buttons. "This is where the pilot sits?" he asked. Alexander nodded. "Yes." Nathan touched the seat reverently. "I want to sit here one day." Something warm spread through Alexander's chest. "Maybe one day you will." Nathan grinned. "Mommy says dreams come true if you work hard." Alexander paused. Then he said, "Your mother is a very smart woman." Nathan nodded. "She is. And she's the best mommy ever." Alexander looked down at his son, the little boy he never knew he had. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to make up for it. Before going to the next, please subscribe to our channel, like and share with friends. Alexander Carter sat in his office the next morning, staring at the stack of contracts on his desk. Normally he would be fully focused, mind sharp as he reviewed every clause, ensuring no detail was overlooked. But today he couldn't concentrate, his mind kept drifting back to Nathan. The boy's excitement at JFK, the way his eyes sparkled as he touched the cockpit controls, his innocent questions about planes, it was a memory Alexander hadn't been able to shake. And he didn't want to. For the first time in years, something other than business occupied his thoughts. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling. His assistant, David Holloway, entered the office, placing a fresh cup of coffee in front of him. "Sir, the board meeting is in an hour," David said. "Will you need additional notes?" Alexander shook his head. "Just the usual briefing." David hesitated before adding, "Also, there's a package for you." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "A package?" David nodded and handed him a small, neatly wrapped box with a note attached. Alexander unfolded the note and recognized Emily's handwriting immediately. "For Nathan's first official day with his father. I thought this might help." Curious, he opened the box. Inside was a small leather-bound notebook. He flipped through the pages and found that each one contained suggestions, ideas for bonding activities with Nathan. Take him to the park. Watch his favorite movie together. Let him pick a restaurant for dinner. Read him a bedtime story. Alexander's chest tightened. Emily had thought of everything. She knew he had no experience with fatherhood, so she was helping him. He pulled out his phone and texted her. "Alexander, thank you for this. It means a lot." A few seconds later, his phone vibrated. "Emily, just try Alexander. He needs his father. More than you know." He stared at her message for a moment before picking up the phone. "David," he said, his voice firm. "Cancel my afternoon meetings. I have somewhere to be." 2 hours later, Alexander found himself walking through Central Park, his pace slower than usual. He wasn't alone. Nathan walked beside him, holding a red balloon Emily had bought him before they arrived. He had been surprisingly quiet, glancing up at Alexander now and then, as if still unsure about him. Alexander, for his part, wasn't sure what to say either. This was uncharted territory for him. He had spent decades mastering negotiations, controlling boardrooms, outsmarting competitors. But a conversation with a 4-year-old? He had no idea where to start. Nathan suddenly stopped walking and pointed. "Can we go there?" Alexander followed his gaze and saw a small carousel spinning ahead. Children laughed as they rode the brightly painted horses, their parents standing nearby. Alexander hesitated. "You want to go on that?" Nathan nodded eagerly. Without thinking twice, Alexander took his hand and led him toward the ride. A few minutes later, Nathan sat on a white horse, his hands gripping the golden pole tightly. Alexander stood beside him, making sure he was secure. As the carousel began to move, Nathan let out a small giggle. Alexander's chest tightened. It was the first time he had heard Nathan laugh. And it was the best sound in the world. As the ride continued, Nathan turned to him. "Do you go on carousels?" Alexander chuckled. "Not for a very long time." Nathan tilted his head. "Why not?" Alexander hesitated before answering. "I guess I've been too busy." Nathan frowned. "Too busy for fun?" Alexander sighed. "Too busy for a lot of things." Nathan didn't say anything, but his small hand reached out and tugged at Alexander's sleeve. "Maybe we can have fun together," Nathan said shyly. Something in Alexander's heart cracked wide open. "Maybe we can," he whispered. After spending the afternoon at the park, Alexander found himself in a small, cozy Italian restaurant near Brooklyn Heights. Emily had agreed to join them for dinner, wanting to see how the day had gone. Nathan was buzzing with excitement, telling his mother every detail of their afternoon together. And then the horse went up and down, and Daddy was standing next to me, and it was so fun. Alexander froze. Daddy. It was the first time Nathan had called him that. Emily's eyes widened slightly, and she met Alexander's gaze across the table. Neither of them spoke, but they didn't have to. Nathan had made his choice. As dinner went on, Emily finally turned to Alexander. So, how was your first day as a dad? Alexander hesitated, then said, terrifying. Emily smirked. Sounds about right. Alexander exhaled. But, also incredible. Emily's expression softened. I'm glad. Nathan suddenly reached for Alexander's hand. Daddy, can we do this again tomorrow? Alexander felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just about making up for lost time anymore. This was about being a father. He squeezed Nathan's tiny hand in his. Yes, we can. Nathan grinned. For the first time in his life, Alexander Carter felt truly happy. Before going to the next, please subscribe to our channel, like and share with friends. Alexander Carter had spent his life solving problems, closing billion-dollar deals, navigating corporate politics, and outsmarting competitors. But now, sitting on a park bench in Brooklyn Heights, watching Nathan chase a squirrel with boundless energy, he realized something. Being a father was an entirely different challenge. Yesterday had been magical. Nathan's first carousel ride, his innocent laughter, and the way he'd called him Daddy for the first time. That one word had shattered every barrier Alexander had built around himself. But today? Today was the real test. Daddy, look. Nathan called out, pointing at a small yellow ball near the sidewalk. Alexander smiled. You want to play catch? Nathan nodded enthusiastically. Alexander picked up the ball and tossed it gently. Nathan caught it, giggling as he threw it back. For a moment, Alexander let himself enjoy the simple joy of playing with his son. But then, Nathan tripped over his own feet, tumbling onto the pavement. For a second, everything felt frozen. Then Nathan's face crumpled, and he let out a loud wail. Alexander's heart stopped. He rushed to his son, kneeling beside him. Nathan, are you okay? Nathan sniffled, looking at his scraped knee, a tiny trickle of blood appearing. It hurts. Alexander felt panic rise in his chest. He had faced aggressive investors, angry board members, and billion-dollar lawsuits, but he had no idea what to do when a 4-year-old got hurt. He pulled out his phone, about to call Emily, but then he stopped. I can't call her every time something happens. I have to figure this out. Taking a deep breath, he scooped Nathan into his arms. Let's go take care of this, buddy. Nathan sniffled but nodded, wrapping his little arms around Alexander's neck. Alexander carried Nathan to a nearby pharmacy on Montague Street. Inside, a kind-looking elderly woman at the counter smiled at them. Oh dear, what happened? Alexander hesitated. He fell. Scraped his knee. The woman nodded knowingly. First time handling a scraped knee, Dad? Alexander stiffened. Was it that obvious? She chuckled. Don't worry. Every dad has that moment. She grabbed a small first aid kit and handed it to him. Antiseptic, bandages, and lollipops. Trust me, the lollipop is the most important part. Nathan sniffled. A lollipop? The woman winked at him. Only for brave boys. Nathan nodded seriously, and Alexander felt a small laugh escape. They sat down at a nearby bench outside the store, and Alexander opened the kit, his hands slightly shaky. Okay, buddy. This might sting a little. Nathan watched him closely, as if testing to see if his dad really knew what he was doing. Alexander dabbed the antiseptic on Nathan's knee. Nathan winced. Ouch. I know, Alexander said quickly. But look, it's already clean. Nathan blinked, as if realizing it wasn't so bad after all. Alexander carefully placed a small bandage over the wound. There. Good as new. Nathan studied his knee and then looked up at Alexander. You did good, Daddy. Something inside Alexander swelled with pride. Then he handed Nathan the lollipop. Nathan's face lit up. Yay. For the first time in his life, Alexander Carter felt like a real father. Later that evening, Alexander dropped Nathan off at Emily's apartment. Nathan ran inside, showing Emily his bandage like a badge of honor. Mommy? Daddy fixed it. Emily raised an eyebrow at Alexander. You handled it? Alexander smirked, feeling oddly proud. Yes, I did. Emily smiled. Welcome to parenting. Alexander leaned against the doorframe, watching as Nathan excitedly told his mother about his day. Emily turned to Alexander. You're doing better than I expected. He chuckled. That makes two of us. She hesitated before saying, I'm glad he has you now. Alexander felt something tighten in his chest. I am too, he admitted that as he left, he realized something. This wasn't just about Nathan getting to know him. He was getting to know himself too. Before going to the next, please subscribe to our channel, like and share with friends. The next morning, Alexander Carter sat in his corner office on the 38th floor of Carter Enterprises, staring at the city skyline. The view of Manhattan was breathtaking, but his mind was somewhere else, on a little boy with a bandaged knee and a wide smile. For the past few days, Nathan had slowly become a part of his life, yet Alexander still felt like a stranger in his own son's world. He was used to business meetings, contracts, and negotiations, but now he had to figure out something far more difficult: how to be a father. A soft knock on the door snapped him back to reality. His assistant, Monica Lewis, stepped in. Sir, there's a woman here to see you. Says it's about your son. Alexander's heart stopped. Emily? Send her in. A few moments later, a tall woman with deep brown eyes and neatly tied black hair walked in. She looked familiar. Mr. Carter, she said, extending a hand. I'm Sophia Ramirez. I work at Nathan's daycare in Brooklyn Heights. Now he remembered. She was one of the teachers Emily had mentioned. He shook her hand. What brings you here, Miss Ramirez? She hesitated before pulling out a small notebook from her bag. Nathan has been talking about you. A lot. Alexander's chest tightened. Is that bad? Sophia gave a small smile. Not at all. He's excited. But, she flipped through the notebook and showed him a page. Nathan's drawings, they were simple, stick figures. But one caught Alexander's eye. A small boy holding hands with a tall man. Underneath, Nathan had written in wobbly letters. Me and Daddy. Alexander felt something shift inside him. Sophia spoke softly. He's happy you're in his life. But he's also scared. Alexander looked up, surprised. Scared? She nodded. He keeps asking me if you'll stay. A strange ache settled in Alexander's chest. He hadn't thought about that. Sophia leaned forward. Mr. Carter, Nathan is young, but he's smart. He's been raised by a single mother his whole life. You showing up? It means the world to him. But if you leave... Alexander swallowed hard. He hadn't considered the damage his presence could cause if he wasn't careful. Sophia gave him a long look. Are you planning to stay in his life? That evening, Alexander found himself outside Emily's apartment in Brooklyn Heights. Emily opened the door, raising an eyebrow. You're early. I need to talk to you. She studied him for a moment before stepping aside. Nathan was on the floor playing with toy cars. When he saw Alexander, his face lit up. Daddy? Alexander smiled, kneeling down. Hey, buddy. Nathan immediately launched into a story about his day at daycare. Alexander listened, but his mind was spinning. After a few minutes, Emily motioned for him to join her in the kitchen. What's going on? She asked, crossing her arms. Alexander exhaled. I met his teacher today. Emily's expression softened. Sophia? He nodded. She told me Nathan is worried I'll leave. Emily's gaze flickered to the living room where Nathan was still playing. I didn't realize how much this would mean to him, Alexander admitted. I don't want to hurt him. Emily sighed. That's why I kept him away from you for so long. I wasn't sure you'd stay. Alexander felt a sting of guilt. He had spent years avoiding responsibility, but now that Nathan was in his life, he couldn't imagine walking away. I want to be here, he said firmly. For real. Emily studied him for a long moment before nodding. Then prove it. That night, Alexander sat with Nathan on the couch, watching a children's show. Nathan leaned against him, completely at ease. Alexander looked down at the boy, his son, and made a silent vow. I won't let him down. For the first time in his life, Alexander Carter felt like he had something worth fighting for. Before going to the next, please subscribe to our channel, like and share with friends. Alexander Carter had spent his life making billion-dollar deals, but as he sat across from his son at a cozy Brooklyn Heights cafe, he realized this was the most important negotiation of his life. Nathan sat on a high stool, swinging his small legs, his curly brown hair bouncing as he took a bite of his chocolate chip pancake. His eyes sparkled as he looked up at Alexander. Daddy, do you like pancakes? Nathan asked, his mouth full. Alexander chuckled. I do, but I don't think mine are as good as yours. Nathan grinned proudly, smearing some syrup on his chin. Emily, who sat across from them, shook her head. Use a napkin, Nathan. Nathan obediently wiped his face, then turned back to Alexander. So, What do daddies do? Alexander hesitated. The question hit him harder than he expected. Well, he said slowly, daddies take care of their kids, they play with them, and he glanced at Emily for help. She smirked. And they teach them things. Like how to ride a bike or tie their shoes. Nathan's face lit up. Can you teach me to ride a bike? Alexander felt a strange warmth spread in his chest. He had never imagined himself doing something as simple, yet meaningful, as this. Of course, he said. When do you want to start? Nathan giggled. Now. Emily raised an eyebrow. At least let him finish his pancakes first. After breakfast, they walked to a nearby park in Brooklyn Heights, where Emily had parked Nathan's small blue bicycle. Alexander had never taught anyone to ride a bike before, but he remembered how his own father, Richard Carter, had taught him decades ago in Central Park. All right, buddy, Alexander said, kneeling beside Nathan. The first rule of riding a bike is... Nathan leaned forward eagerly. Don't fall? Alexander chuckled. Sort of. But the real rule is, always keep moving. Emily watched quietly as Alexander positioned himself behind the bike, gripping the seat. Okay, Nathan, he said. I'll hold you for now, but you have to keep pedaling. Nathan nodded, determination on his little face. Ready? Ready? Alexander gave the bike a small push, jogging beside Nathan as he pedaled. For a few moments, everything was going great, until Nathan suddenly wobbled. Daddy, he shouted, gripping the handlebars tightly. Alexander caught him before he could fall, steadying the bike. You're okay, he assured. Let's try again. Emily smiled softly as she watched them. Seeing Alexander put in real effort meant more to her than any grand gesture of wealth ever could. For the next half hour, Alexander patiently guided Nathan. Every time Nathan lost balance, Alexander was there to catch him. And then, something magical happened. Nathan started riding on his own. Look, Mommy. Look, Daddy, he yelled, laughing in excitement as he pedaled forward. Alexander stood frozen for a second, watching the moment unfold. For the first time he truly felt like a father. Later that evening, back in his penthouse in Manhattan, Alexander sat in his study, staring at a photo on his desk. It was an old picture of his father, Richard Carter. The man had been a ruthless businessman, one of the richest men in New York, yet one of the coldest fathers. Growing up, Alexander had been raised by nannies and tutors, while his father had been too busy with his billion-dollar empire. The only time Richard ever showed interest in Alexander was when he turned 18 and was expected to take over the family business. Alexander had hated it, equals. He had promised himself he'd never be like his father. Yet somehow he had almost made the same mistakes. Until Nathan walked into his life. Alexander sighed, rubbing his temples. He needed to be different. He needed to be better. Just then his phone buzzed. It was Emily. Hey, he said, answering. Hey, Emily's voice came through, softer than usual. I just wanted to say, thank you. Alexander raised an eyebrow. For what? For today, she said. For being there for Nathan. Alexander leaned back in his chair. I should have been there sooner. There was a brief pause. You're here now, Emily said. And that's what matters. Alexander stared out at the city lights. He never thought he'd hear those words from her. Before he could respond, Emily continued, her tone more serious. There's something else I need to tell you. Alexander sat up. What is it? Emily hesitated. It's about Nathan's last name. Alexander's pulse quickened. What about it? Emily took a deep breath. Nathan's last name is Carter. Alexander's breath caught. He had never known. You gave him my last name? Emily's voice was barely above a whisper. Yes. Because I always hoped you'd come back. Alexander closed his eyes, feeling a mix of guilt and unexpected warmth. Nathan Carter. He repeated the name in his head, realizing that, for the first time, it felt right. That night, Alexander made a decision that he pulled open his desk drawer and took out a document he had been avoiding for weeks. His last will and testament. Until now, everything in his estate had been set to go to his business partners and charity funds. But now he had someone else to think about. Grabbing a pen, Alexander crossed out a name and in its place wrote, Nathan Carter, sole beneficiary. As soon as the ink dried, he exhaled. Nathan would never have to worry about being abandoned or ignored, not like Alexander had been. Because this time, Alexander wasn't going anywhere. Before going to the next, please subscribe to our channel, like and share with friends. The next morning, Alexander Carter woke up feeling different. There was a sense of purpose in his chest, a feeling he hadn't known before. 4 years, his life had revolved around billion-dollar deals, boardroom politics, and maintaining the Carter empire. But now his world had shifted. Nathan Carter. His son. The thought still sent waves of shock through him. He had spent 7 years not knowing that he had a child. And the truth still burned in his mind. Why had Emily kept it from him? Determined to get answers, Alexander texted Emily. "Meet me at the plaza. 10 a.m. We need to talk." The response came within minutes. "Okay." At exactly 10 a.m., Alexander sat in a private corner of the Palm Court at the Plaza Hotel, waiting. Emily arrived 5 minutes later, dressed in a simple blue blouse and black jeans. She looked cautious, as if preparing for a battle. She sat across from him, her hands folded on the table. "I figured you'd have questions." Alexander exhaled sharply. "You think?" Emily sighed. "I know you're angry." "I'm not angry, Emily," Alexander interrupted, his voice controlled. "I'm furious. You kept my son from me for 7 years. 7. Why?" Emily bit her lip, then looked away. "Because I didn't trust you." Alexander felt a sting. "You didn't trust me?" "I was in love with you, Emily. We were planning a future together." She met his gaze, her eyes pained. "Were we?" "Because, from where I stood, you were more in love with your business than with me. You never even noticed when I needed you." Alexander clenched his jaw. "That's not fair." "Isn't it?" Emily leaned forward. "When I found out I was pregnant, I wanted to tell you. But you were barely in my life anymore. Your father had just passed away, you took over Carter Industries, and suddenly, everything was about the company. I tried to reach you, but you were too busy." Alexander's chest tightened. He remembered those days. The stress, the endless meetings, the pressure to prove himself worthy of the Carter legacy. Had he really been so blind? "I didn't want Nathan to grow up feeling like an afterthought," Emily continued, her voice soft. "So I made the hardest choice of my life. I walked away." Alexander ran a hand through his hair. "You should have told me anyway. That wasn't your decision to make alone." Emily's eyes filled with regret. "You're right. I should have." Silence hung between them, thick with emotions neither of them could fully express. Finally, Emily spoke. "I'm not trying to keep Nathan from you. I never was. But I needed to know that if you were going to be in his life, it wouldn't be as a part-time father. It had to be all or nothing." Alexander inhaled deeply. Then, with determination, he said, "I want to be in his life. Fully." Emily studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Okay." Later that afternoon, Emily called him with an invitation that caught him off guard. "My parents want to meet you," she said hesitantly. "They've been Nathan's only father figure all these years. I think it's important they know what kind of man you are now." Alexander agreed without hesitation. At 6 p.m., he found himself standing outside a modest brownstone in Park Slope, Brooklyn. It was a far cry from the luxury penthouses and corporate skyscrapers he was used to. Emily's mother, Linda Walker, opened the door, her expression unreadable. "Alexander," she said coolly. "Come in." Inside, the house felt warm and lived in. Framed family photos lined the walls, many of them featuring Nathan. Emily's father, George Walker, stood by the fireplace, arms crossed. He was a retired schoolteacher, a man of principle and quiet strength. "So," George said after a long silence, "you finally decided to show up." Alexander met his gaze, understanding the resentment in his voice. "I know I can't change the past, Mr. Walker. But I want to make things right now." George studied him for a moment before nodding. "Then prove it." Nathan, who had been playing in the next room, came running in. "Daddy," he shouted excitedly. Alexander's heart swelled as he bent down to hug his son. That hug said more than words ever could. As Alexander left the Walker's house that night, his phone buzzed. It was a message from his private investigator, Daniel Reed. "Boss, I found something. You need to see this. Urgent." Alexander's stomach tightened. He drove straight to his office at Carter Industries, where Daniel was waiting with a folder in hand. Daniel slid it across the desk. "It's about Nathan's birth certificate." Alexander frowned as he flipped it open. Then his breath caught. Father's name, unknown. His name wasn't on the birth certificate. "What the hell is this?" Alexander asked, his voice sharp. Daniel looked grim. "That's not all. Emily had Nathan's last name legally changed to Carter a few years ago, but she never put your name on any of the legal documents." Alexander's blood boiled. "Why?" Daniel hesitated. "I don't know. But there's one more thing. A man named Brian Harding signed Nathan's school admission forms as his legal guardian." Alexander felt like the air had been knocked out of him. Who the hell is Brian Harding? Daniel looked uncomfortable. Emily's ex-boyfriend. A wave of anger and betrayal hit Alexander. He thought Emily was being honest with him. But now he wasn't sure what to believe. Before going to the next, please subscribe to our channel, like and share with friends. Alexander Carter sat in his office at Carter Industries, staring at the birth certificate in front of him. His hands clenched into fists as he read the words again. Father's name, unknown. His name wasn't on his son's birth certificate. And worse, Brian Harding, Emily's ex-boyfriend, had signed Nathan's school documents as his legal guardian. Alexander had spent the past week believing Emily's story, trying to build a relationship with his son, and even making an effort with Emily's family. But now doubt crept in like a slow-burning fire. Had Emily lied to him all along? Had Nathan ever truly been his? His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Daniel Reed, his private investigator. Boss, I did some digging on Brian Harding. You're going to want to hear this. Alexander took a deep breath. Tell me. Brian and Emily dated on and off after she left you. But here's the thing, Brian has a history of fraud. He was caught in a scandal years ago, forging documents to claim legal rights over a child that wasn't his. Alexander's heartbeat accelerated. You think he did the same with Nathan? Daniel hesitated. I can't prove it yet, but it's a possibility. A dangerous thought settled in Alexander's mind. What if Brian had forged his way into Nathan's life? What if Emily had been covering for him? An hour later, Alexander stormed into Emily's apartment in Park Slope, Brooklyn. Emily looked startled as she opened the door. Alexander? What? He held up the birth certificate. Why isn't my name on this, Emily? Her face paled. I can explain. Alexander stepped inside, his voice sharp. You told me you left because I was too busy for you. But you never mentioned Brian Harding. Was he there when you left me? Emily took a deep breath. No. I met Brian a year later. Then why did he sign Nathan's school forms as his legal guardian? Tears welled up in Emily's eyes. Because I was scared. Alexander clenched his jaw. Scared of what? She hesitated before whispering, you. His chest tightened. Me? Emily nodded. After I left, I knew you would be angry if I told you the truth. And when Nathan was born, I was afraid you'd try to take him away. You had all the power, Alexander. You could have taken him from me in a heartbeat. Alexander exhaled sharply, his anger fighting with the pain in his chest. I would never have taken Nathan from you. Emily wiped at her tears. Brian was a mistake. He offered to help when Nathan started school and I let him. I was trying to protect my son. Alexander ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. So, you forged my name out of his life? She shook her head. No. I was going to tell you, but you didn't. His voice was calm, but the disappointment in it made Emily flinch. For a long moment they stared at each other. Finally Emily said, What do you want to do? Alexander looked toward Nathan's bedroom door. His son. He turned back to Emily. A DNA test. Now. Emily froze, but after a moment she nodded. 2 days later, Alexander sat in a private clinic, staring at the results in his hands. 99.9% match. Nathan was his son. Relief flooded through him, but it was mixed with frustration. He had spent 7 years unaware of his own child. He had missed his first words, his first steps, his first day of school. And all because Emily had been afraid. As he walked out of the clinic, his phone rang. It was Emily. Did you get the results? She asked quietly. Yes, he said, his voice controlled. He's mine. Emily sighed. I'm sorry, Alexander. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. I want full custody. Silence. Then, what? You kept my son from me for 7 years, Emily. I don't trust you anymore. I'm taking this to court. Tears filled Emily's voice. Alexander, please. Don't do this. But Alexander had made up his mind. He wasn't going to be a part-time father. He was going to be Nathan's father. Fully. Before going to the next, please subscribe to our channel, like and share with friends. The skyline of New York City stretched beyond the glass windows of Carter Industries headquarters, where Alexander Carter sat at his massive mahogany desk. His hands rested on an envelope he had been avoiding all day. It contained the results of the DNA test. 4 weeks he had been grappling with the shocking arrival of Emily Bennett, the woman he once loved who had vanished from his life 7 years ago, only to return with a child claiming it was his. Nathan. The boy had his eyes, his mannerisms, even his love for numbers. But after being deceived once, Alexander needed absolute proof. He took a deep breath and ripped open the envelope. His eyes scanned the document. 99.9% probability of paternity. His heart pounded. It was real. Nathan was his son. A mix of emotions swirled inside him. Anger for the years stolen from him, relief that the truth was finally clear, and a deep, overwhelming sense of responsibility. He had spent years building an empire. Now he had to build something far more important, a relationship with his son. That evening, Alexander pulled up in front of Emily's Brooklyn apartment. It wasn't anything luxurious, but it was cozy and warm, the kind of place a loving mother would create for her child. When Emily opened the door, her face was filled with apprehension. "Did you get the results?" she asked quietly. Alexander nodded, stepping inside. Nathan was watching cartoons in the living room, unaware of the life-altering conversation happening just feet away. "I know the truth now," Alexander said, his voice controlled but firm. "Nathan is my son." Emily swallowed hard. "I never lied about that." Alexander exhaled sharply. "But you lied about why you left." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes. "I was scared, Alexander. You were always so focused on your career. I thought I would just be a distraction. And when I found out I was pregnant, I convinced myself that leaving was the best thing for all of us." Alexander's hands clenched into fists. "So many lost years. You stole my chance to be a father." Emily wiped a tear from her cheek. "I know. And I regret it every single day." For the first time, Alexander saw the guilt in her eyes. The pain. The sacrifice she had made. A long silence filled the space between them. Finally, Alexander sighed. "Nathan deserves to know me. To have both of us." Emily's lips quivered. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I want to be in his life. Fully. Not just some weekend visitor." Her shoulders relaxed slightly. "I want that too." Days turned into weeks. Alexander slowly became a part of Nathan's world. Picking him up from school, helping with homework, taking him to Yankee games. One evening as they sat in the park, Nathan looked up at him. "Dad." Alexander's heart skipped a beat. It was the first time Nathan had called him that. "Yes, buddy?" Nathan fidgeted with his shoelaces. "Are you mad at Mom?" Alexander sighed. "I was. But sometimes adults make mistakes. And what matters is that we fix them." Nathan nodded. "I'm glad you're here now." Alexander swallowed the lump in his throat. "Me too." One afternoon, as Emily and Nathan were visiting Alexander's penthouse in Manhattan, he made a decision. After dinner, he pulled Emily aside. "I want you both to move in here." Emily's eyes widened. "What?" "I lost 7 years with my son. I don't want to lose any more time. This isn't just about Nathan. It's about us." Emily's breath hitched. "Alexander?" "I still love you," he admitted. "I never stopped." Tears welled up in her eyes. "I love you too." Alexander cupped her face, brushing away her tears, and whispered, "Then let's not waste any more time." That night, Nathan fell asleep in his new room, and Alexander held Emily in his arms, knowing their family was finally whole.